In part 2 for our lectures on aggregate expenditures, we're going to focus on learning 4 formulas that apply to our aggregate expenditures function. The first formula that we need to understand is what we call the marginal propensity to consume, or what we hyphenate as the MPC. And what the marginal propensity to consume is going to tell us is the relationship that exists between changes in disposable income and total consumption. In other words, think about yourself. When your income changes, that alters the amount of money that you spend, right? If you get a raise, then you're going to spend more money. If you get a pay cut, you're going to spend less money. So that's what the MPC is telling us, is how much will consumers alter their consumption expenditures when they have a change in their disposable income. And the value that you come up with when you calculate the marginal propensity to consume is actually going to be the slope of your existing consumption function. So you'll recall that when we were graphing our consumption function, we were graphing it as a straight line. So what that means is that it's not going to change. So in other words, for every change in income that you have, your MPC is going to remain constant, which is why we would say that the MPC is the slope of this consumption function right here. But let's go ahead and look at some numbers to see exactly how we would calculate it. So again, what we would want to do is start off with a table giving us the information in terms of our consumption in relation to disposable income. So again, let's say that I just have these 3 different levels of income listed here, actually 4 because I'm starting out with 0, and then I can look and see what is the consumption that's taking place at the different levels of income. So let's say, for example, when my income is 0, my consumption was 30, and so again, remember, that is what we call autonomous consumption. In other words, any consumption that takes place that is not dependent upon income, meaning income is 0, that's going to be autonomous. And then as my consumption increases, it's because my disposable income increases. So let's say when my disposable income increases to 100, I now spend $100. When it increases to 200, I now spend 170. And when it increases to 300, it now increases to 240. So from this information, I can calculate my MPC. So remember, the marginal propensity to consume is just the change in consumption that's going to take place when there's a change in your income. Hold on, there we go. All right, change in disposable income. So what we're looking over here for is, what is the change in consumption? So notice that when I went from 0 to 100, my consumption went from $30 to $100. So the change is the difference between those numbers. 100 minus 30 equals 70. So that's the change in consumption. And then I do the same thing to see the change in income. My income went from 0 to 100, we see here. So in other words, we can clearly take the 100 minus 0, and so we see that the change in disposable income was 100. And now we just plug those numbers into our formula. Change in consumption divided by change in income, we come up with 0.7. So our MPC is going to be 0.7, which is the same thing as saying that every time I have a change in income, I'm going to spend 70% of that change. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. In other words, every time my income was increasing by $100, when it went from 0 to 100 to 200 to 300, the additional consumption that was taking place was $70, which is equivalent of 70% of that $100 change in income. Again, also another thing that you would note is that if you were graphing the consumption function, so you have your 45-degree line here, and then of course I graphed that information here, that consumption function, the slope would equal 0.7. In other words, the slope of the consumption function is going to be the value of your MPC. Now remember, any money of, any disposable income that you get that you're not spending, that means you have to be saving it. So we also have a corresponding, what we call marginal propensity to save. In other words, every time you have a change in income, any money that you're not spending, you're going to be saving. So we can calculate the marginal propensity to save. So again, if I go ahead and put down the same data that I had on the previous slide, in terms of my disposable income, I had these different levels of income with the corresponding levels of consumption. What I can do is add a third column of data to see how much I'm saving at every level of disposable incomes. Because remember, disposable income equals consumption plus saving. So we can clearly see that when disposable income was 0, consumption was 30, which means savings had to be negative 30. In other words, those two numbers have to add up to equal disposable income. When disposable income is 100, consumption is 100, which means savings has to be 0. When disposable income is 200, consumption was 170, which means savings had to be 30. And then when disposable income was 300, consumption was 240, so savings had to be 60. In other words, this number, 240, plus this number, 60, has to equal this number, 300. And of course, that has to be for every single row of data. So now that we've calculated our saving that's going to take place at the different levels of disposable income, we can now calculate our MPS, which again, MPS is just the change in savings divided by the change in the disposable income. So how much will I alter how much I save every time I have a change in my income? So again, in this case, we would look to see, well, what is the change in saving? So again, we can come over here and look and see that when income went from 100 to 200, savings went from 0 to 30. So 30 minus 0 equals 30. So that's our change in saving. And then of course we have to calculate our change in disposable income. And so again, we can clearly see that our disposable income changed from 100 to 200. So we would just do 200 minus 100, and we come up with 100. So there's our change in saving, there's our change in disposable income. We plug those numbers into the formula, through 30 divided by 100, we come up with 0.3. So again, that's the value of our MPS, and what that means is every time you have a change in your income, you're going to save 30% of it. So we already calculated on the previous slide, you're going to spend 70% of it, which of course means that you have to be saving 30%, because those are the only two things that you can do with your money: spend it or save it. Now, just like when we looked at the consumption function, the slope of saving function equals the value of your MPS. So again, just like we said, the slope of the consumption function is your MPC, the slope of the saving function is going to be your MPS. Now again, because the only two things you can do with your money is spend it or save it, in other words, remember we said disposable income equals consumption plus saving. Well, also, if we're calculating the marginals, we know that the MPC plus the MPS have to equal 1, or 100% of that change in income. In other words, let's say, for example, your MPC was 0.75, meaning that for every change in income, you're going to spend 75% of it. That means you have to be saving 25%. So that means the value of your MPS has to be 0.25 so that you come up with the value 1. So again, a shortcut to figure out MPC and MPS if you already have the value of 1 is just to remember that they have to add up to equal 1. So again, if I said, MPS equals 0.35, solve for MPC, you would just take 1 minus 0.35 to come up with 0.65 for your MPC. So again, just a shortcut to calculate what the value of your MPC or MPS is if you already have the value of 1. Now here we have on some graphs some 3 different consumption functions and then their correlating saving function. In other words, remember we said that if you're not spending all of your change in income, then that means you have to be saving it. So notice that consumption function 3 right here has a slope of 0.6. In other words, it says the MPC is 0.60, which means that's the slope of that consumption function. So that means for that particular consumption function, for a change in income, they are spending 60% of that change in income, which means the corresponding MPS has to have a value of 0.4. So the corresponding saving function would be this one right here, where it says 0.4. In other words, the MPC plus the MPS have to equal 1. So you can easily see which consumption function correlates to each savings function in the other graph. And again, this is just because you have to account for all of your money. So if you have a change in income of $100 and you're spending $60 of it, that means you have to be saving $40 of it. Now obviously the higher the MPC, if we're looking over here, the greater the portion of any additional income that consumers are ultimately going to spend. So in other words, notice that an MPC of 0.8 and relative to an MPC of 0.6 just means that consumers are spending a larger percentage of their change in income. If I had a change in income of $100 and my MPC was 0.8, what that means is I'm going to spend $80 of it and only save 20. Whereas if I have an MPC of 0.6, then that means I'm only going to spend $60 of it and save 40. So again, if people spend a greater portion of their extra disposable income, then they have to save a smaller portion because of our formula, MPC plus MPS equals 1. Now that we've covered how to calculate our MPC and our MPS, what we can now cover is 2 more formulas, and that is just our averages. In other words, what if we don't have a change in income, we just want to see on average how much are consumers spending and saving based on their current income. Then we wouldn't need to use our MPC and MPS formulas, then we're just going to go ahead and calculate the average. So the average is just calculated by taking the current level of consumption and dividing it by the current level of disposable income. And then again, that will tell you on average how much consumers are spending in relation to their disposable income. So again, I can go back and start out with that same information that we had on the previous slides. Which looked something like this. And then I can calculate from that what my average propensity to consume is just by, let me rewrite that. Just by taking the averages. And so in this case, the numbers aren't going to remain constant. So if I want to know on average how much do people spend when their disposable income is 100, then I would take the consumption, which is 100, and divide it by the disposable income, which is 100. So I come up with the value of 1, meaning that on average, when disposable income is $100, people spend 100% of their money. Then I can look and see, well, what is the APC when disposable income equals 200? Again, then I would just take consumption at that level, which is 170, and divide it by 200. And let's see mathematically what I come up with. 170 divided by 200, you come up with 0.85. So again, what that means is that when disposable income is 200, on average, we spend 85% of it. And then we can do the same thing to see when disposable income is 300. When disposable income is 300, consumption is 240. So, oh, I forgot to put 0.85 right here. So now we would do 240 divided by 300. And when we do that math, we come up with 0.8. So in other words, that means that when disposable income is 300, on average, consumers spend 80% of their money. So again, that's all we have to do to calculate the average propensity to consume is just take consumption and divide it by the current level of disposable income. Now, of course, I already told you that the only two things you can do with your money is spend it or save it. So if we have an average propensity to consume, then that means we also have an average propensity to save. So the formula for us to calculate our average propensity to save, or also what I hyphenate as the APS, is just going to be the current level of saving that's taking place in relation to the current level of disposable income that's taking place. So if we go ahead and look at saving compared to disposable income based on the data we were looking at before, we know that saving was 0 when disposable income was 100, it was 30 when disposable income was 20, and it was 60 when disposable income was 300. So now we can calculate what our average propensity to save is based on this data. And so, of course, you're just going to take the values for each row. So when disposable income was 100, we have a value of saving is a 0. 0 divided by 100, that's going to be 0. So on average, when income is 100, we save nothing. When disposable income increased to 200, saving increased to 30. So we would just do 30 divided by 200. And so mathematically, we come up with 0.15. So on average, when disposable income is $200, on average we save 15% of it. And then we can do the same thing for when disposable income is 300. We look and see saving is 60, divide it by 300, and so we can see with that the APS is going to have a value of 0.2. Now again, notice that these values, if we were to add them to the values that we just looked at on the previous slide when we calculated APC, if we added them together, we would come up with the value of 1. In other words, if I take that data from that previous slide and then add in the APS right here, we said that the average propensity to save when disposable income was 100 was 0. The average propensity to save when disposable income was 200 was 0.15. And the average propensity to save when disposable income was 300 was 0.2. Notice that when we add the APC to the APS, we get a value of 1. Meaning that, again, all the money is accounted for. If on average I'm spending 80% of it, that means on average I'm saving 20% of it. So again, a shortcut formula to remember is that your APC plus your APS always have to equal 1. So if I said APS equals 0.1, solve for APC, well, APC is just going to be 1 minus 0.1, so it has to be 0.9. So again, all of your money is accounted for. If you're saving 10% of it, that means you are on average spending 90% of it. Now let's just do a couple review questions before we wrap up this short tutorial. Suppose you get a raise at work and your disposable income increased $500 a month. You chose to spend $450 and then you saved $50, and I'm asking you to calculate your MPC. So clearly we see that the change in disposable income was $500. The change in consumption was $450, and the change in saving was $50. So now we just plug those numbers into our formulas to figure out our MPC versus our MPS. So MPC is change in consumption divided by change in disposable income, which we see is $450 divided by 500. So $450 divided by 500, we come up with 0.9. So over here, your MPC is going to be 0.9. And then you can do the same thing for your MPS. The formula for the MPS is the change in saving divided by the change in disposable income, which we see is 50 divided by 500, which you come up with 0.1. So that would be your answer right over here, is just 0.1. Now remember, I also told you that the MPC plus the MPS must always equal 1, so we know this is a true statement. So I really didn't even need to use this formula to calculate MPS after I'd already calculated MPC. In other words, once I calculated MPC to be 0.9, then I could have just done MPS is 1 minus 0.9, which would have given me that 0.10. So again, that was just the shortcut that I could have done instead. And then the last thing I have here is just a worksheet where to give you some practice calculating the different formulas that we've learned thus far. So you'll notice that I have a blank right here for my consumption column, and we know that consumption is simple, or disposable income is simply consumption plus saving. So if saving when consumption was 4,000, saving was 2,100, then basically I'm just solving for X. In other words, what plus 2,100 is going to equal 4,000? And so we know that that would be 1,900. And then for saving column, we're doing the same thing. In other words, this has to equal this plus this. So what do I add to 400 in order to get 1,000? We know that you would add 600 to it. And then of course, when disposable income is 3,000, consumption was 1,400, which means savings had to be 1,600. So those were fairly easy to figure out because we know disposable income is consumption plus saving. Now moving on to our MPC and MPS columns. First, MPC. Again, we know our formula is change in consumption divided by change in disposable income. However, notice that I give you a value of MPS right here of 0.5. And we know that MPC plus MPS always equals 1. So if my MPS is 0.5, that means my MPC also has to be 0.5. Another thing that I told you is that we are always doing straight line consumption and savings functions, which means the slopes don't change. So the MPC and the MPS are both the slopes, which means they have to be the same regardless of what the level of disposable income is. So in other words, if the slope was 0.5 at 3,000, it also has to be 0.5 at 4,000, 0.5 at 2,000, and 0.5 at 1,000 because it's a straight line slope. So again, that means that my MPS had to be 0.5 also at all the different levels of disposable income. So just the fact that I gave you that one piece of information, that 0.5 at a disposable income of 3,000, that allowed you to use our shortcut of MPS plus MPS equals 1 and then easily fill in the data for all of the different rows. And then the last two columns of data, that's just your APC and your APS. So for the first one, you can use the shortcut because, again, you know that APC plus APS equals 1. So if APS equals 0.6, that means APC has to equal 0.4. However, for the rest of them, we will actually have to do the calculations because those don't remain constant. So in other words, to calculate the average propensity to consume when disposable income is 2,000, we just look at this data over here. We would do 900 divided by 2,000, and we would come up with 0.45. And then we can use our shortcut. In other words, if the APC is 0.45, then that means the APS has to be 0.55 because they have to add up to equal 1. Then I look and see what is my average propensity to consume when disposable income is 300. So now I'm looking at this data. So I would do 1,400 divided by 3,000. And I'd come up with approximately 0.47. And so again, I would do 1 minus 0.47 to get my APS, which is 0.53. And then I would do the last thing for when disposable income is 4,000. We see that when disposable income is 4,000, consumption is 1,900. So I just do 1,900 divided by 4,000. And I come up with approximately 0.48. And then I can just do 1 minus 0.48, and I get 0.52 for my APS. So again, even though I use shortcuts a lot in this exercise, you also want to make sure that you do know the formulas in case you cannot utilize the shortcuts. So MPC is just going to be change in consumption divided by change in disposable income. MPS is going to be change in saving divided by change in disposable income. Your APC, that's just the average, so you just take consumption and divide it by disposable income. And the APS is just the average of savings, so saving divided by disposable income. And then, of course, your shortcut formulas are down here.